The following is a Laura Flanders Show minicast.
Abolish ICE. It's a slogan that has been gaining traction recently. The dividing of families and seizure of kids, along with bans on migrants from Muslim countries. Donald Trump's hardline policies have all sorts of people asking how our immigration rules got to be so open to abuse and what alternatives might there be. Is there any country that treats migrants well? And if so, what could we learn from them? For those questions and more, I've invited two people into the studio to chew things over. Atossa Araxia Abrahamian is a senior editor at The Nation magazine. Her book, The Cosmopolites, focuses on the buying and selling of citizenship. John Torpey is a professor of sociology and history and director of the Ralph Bunche Institute for International Studies right here at the Graduate Center of the University of New York. He is also an author of a number of books, including The Invention of the Passport, Surveillance, Citizenship, and the State. Well, let's start with just ICE for a second, because it feels like it's been with us a long time, but the Immigration Control Enforcement Agency is actually kind of a new product of 9/11, isn't it? When did it come into being, and what was there before?
It is. After 9/11, INS, which was Immigration and Naturalization Services, was transformed, and part of that transformation was the creation of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, which is what we now refer to as ICE. It's a relatively new agency. It's not hard to imagine a world without it. The question is, what do you replace it with?
I mean, it went from being a service, INS, to being an enforcement operation. It all kind of got into the whole question of security. Immigration became central to our questions of concerns about security. Was that always the case?
No, I think it hasn't always been the case. I mean, I think in many ways, originally or earlier in any case in the United States, immigration was seen principally as a labor question, right? And the question was who was going to do certain kinds of work, who was going to have access to certain kinds of jobs. And that's, long been a kind of concern in, how immigration is regulated by states who feel an obligation to protect their populations and to enhance their economic opportunities. So this hasn't always, been as harsh, but it's often had this kind of aspect about giving people access to jobs or denying them access to those jobs.
The interesting thing about bringing the two of you together is that you kind of destabilize our ideas around statehood and nationality. You with your history, your work in the history, which I want to hear about more, and you with your discussion of the present and this whole kind of golden passports scandal. Passports are being bought and traded on the market?
Yeah, it's totally legal, and that's what shocks people the most. You think of buying a passport as something a James Bond villain would do to run away from the law. It's an extremely large business, a lot of money coming in and out of countries that are completely willing to sell their citizenship to somebody who has anywhere from, $200,000 to upwards of $1 million.
So wait, what? Give me a story. So how does that happen?
So let's start from the beginning.
Yeah.
In the 1980s, the country St. Kitts and Nevis, a Caribbean country, amended their Nationality Act and said, okay, there's a clause where if you give us money, we'll give you citizenship. Of course, I'm oversimplifying, but that was the seed of the citizenship by investment world. And then 30 years later, some consultants came in and they said, well, look, you guys can make a lot of money by doing this, but you got to do it better. You can't just have it buried in your law. And so they started marketing this citizenship scheme. They branded it Citizenship by Investment, not passport selling. Of course, Citizenship by Investment sounds a lot more proper and genteel, and began going around the world with officials from St. Kitts and pitching this to rich people, pitching this to their accountants, pitching this to their lawyers and their wealth advisors as a way to have a backup plan in case things go south at home, as a way to optimize their tax bill, and as a way to, keep their families safe. So it became, as a result of the St. Kitts initiative, a booming business, not just in the Caribbean, but in Europe as well.
So I don't want to put you on the spot here, but any sense of how many citizens little bitty St. Kitts has?
St. Kitts has about 50,000 citizens, and on top of that, several thousand investor citizens.
So would that work in the States? If you came in with enough money, do you get preferential treatment from the ICE?
We have an investment program, but it's very, very small. But I know that in Canada, they've done this. And basically the idea is that somebody's supposed to come in, invest a certain amount of money, and create jobs for people. So that helps to make it seem
it
more legitimate.
Greases the wheels,
it's
right?
Very desirable, right? Somebody's going to come in, create a lot of jobs.
I mean, there is an argument to be made, and I'm sure there are lots of people who would make the argument that people with resources should be encouraged to come. It's your right as a country to privilege people who will come with some resources, job creators, the folks that Trump talks about. How do you think about that, Atossa, as you balance different interests around this issue?
It is a state's right to decide who comes in and who stays out, right? So the objection isn't that it's illegitimate or illegal, it's that it isn't fair. People who would be arguing in favor of the citizenship industry would say, well, it's less arbitrary than being born. It's less arbitrary than choosing your parents. It's something that you could theoretically work towards. If you really want to be a St. Kitts citizen, you can save up your pennies, and at some point you'll have $250,000 you can spend on a passport. And I think that there's a point to that. I don't think that it's a fully convincing argument, but that is a side of it.
So if it's already being treated as a kind of a mercantile affair, why not just set up a cash register at the border?
Sure. We'd have to lower the price probably for most people, unless you want to be a country of just the 1%.
All right, so passports, citizenship, it's a much more mutable phenomenon. Have we always had passports?
Well, this is a question I often get asked as a result of having written this book. And I mean, I think it's very difficult to say exactly when these things first started. The side that we are probably most attuned to is the restrictive side. And I think that side really goes back to the fact that there were all kinds of systems of forced labor until, the middle of the 19th century. Not that it doesn't still exist, of course, but it was much more about them not getting away than it was about them coming in until, I would say, the middle of the 19th century. Then, moving around became easier. Passage on ships became easier and cheaper. More and more people were able to do it. And then the concern started with the rise of the idea of nationalism. The concern was, who are these people who are coming in? And that was connected in part to an expansion of people's citizenship rights, the right, in other words, the access to the right to vote. So if people were part of the political system in a way that they hadn't been before, it sort of mattered more in a way who they were. Were they people we could trust? Were they people like us? Were they going to live by the values and norms that we, took for granted and that sort of thing? So could they be integrated, in effect?
Do we have any sense of how many people actually exist in the world without citizenship, Atossa?
Yeah, the UN estimates that there are around 10 million stateless people in the world. About 1 million of them are the Rohingya, a minority in Myanmar. And these are people who are not recognized by the state in which they live or in which they are born. So they're legally without a country.
And what does that mean for them?
It means that their life is extremely difficult. All of the little bureaucratic things that we do every day, we go to the DMV, we sign up for health insurance. This is made much harder if you don't have a national ID or proof of citizenship. It also means that they cannot travel very easily. Sometimes it means they are barred from certain jobs, like in the Gulf states, the stateless people who are known as the Bidun don't have access to certain government jobs. Sometimes they can't take their kids to certain doctors. I mean, it's really institutionalized discrimination.
I mean, in the U.S., I feel like we're somewhat insulated, but you leave the United States, particularly go to Europe, and the question of refugees, including many of them stateless people, is front and center of the politic. And I guess one of the questions I have is when we have this kind of congruence of crises, does something new emerge that has potential to take us in a new direction?
Well, I mean, back to the question of statelessness, in the early post-World War I period, there were lots of people, because of the collapse of various empires in Europe, who suddenly were cut adrift. Their states were not going to give them the documents they needed to move around, and that led to the creation of something called the Nansen Passport, which was named for a Norwegian explorer and humanitarian who was the first League of Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. So this was a kind of stopgap measure that was created, indeed under this guy's name, think about that, to provide people who had no documents with a document that would allow them to negotiate international borders. I mean, the current or the recent refugee crisis in Europe, didn't necessarily have a great deal to do with the stateless, but it had to do with people who were leaving various circumstances that were either dangerous or unappealing in some other way. There, of course, the questions are, do you do something to fix the circumstances that those people are living in so that they don't feel the urge to leave as much. But of course, there is a gap in wealth in the world that is going to attract a certain number of people no matter what happens.
So I'm getting the picture that this is all about who serves whose interests and who presents themselves or could present a challenge to the status quo. Is there any model of great immigration policy or places where this is done differently? Atossa?
Listen, in the States, it's been better at some points in history and worse in others. In Europe, it's been better at some points and worse in others. It's really never great, and that's because of all of the reasons that John outlined, rise of nationalism, this exclusionary function of the state, which really, the point of a country is to keep people out of it. And so as you build up this idea of what the country does and how it serves its people, at some point, the enforcement's going to become more and more strict.
And if those with money and influence continue to determine all of this, I can't see anything changing very much. But there is the possibility that the sense of outrage that you're seeing across the country right now could be translated into something in the way of change. What do you see that gives you any kind of reason for optimism, Atossa?
In terms of the immigration system, I do think that people are starting to realize that the whole idea of a border is sort of inherently violent and unjust on a global scale. With this terrible news about climate change, we're all doomed. And at some point, we're going to have to start thinking of ourselves not as people with borders between us, but as a humanity that needs to take action. And maybe I'm being too optimistic, but I do think that message will go through at some point.
And you got down to the titling of your book with this fabulous word, Cosmopolites. Who are the Cosmopolites?
Oh, it depends who you ask. Cosmopolites are citizens of the world. So I think we're all on some level global, and that's something we need to acknowledge, even if we do believe in nationalism, and even if some people do have views that aren't what we think of as cosmopolitan. We are all part of this world.
I think that's a good note on which to end. Ojalá, I hope we all end up being part of the same world. Thank you so much, John. Atossa, it's a pleasure to have you. We'll have more information and links to both of the books at our website. That's lauraflanders.org.